The problems facing New Zealand's primary sector have been mounting at a rapid pace. So I think it's time for open hearts and open minds.
Nā mai hoki mai, and welcome back to our Sarah's Country whānau, our family that is growing around a vision to see Aotearoa New Zealand recognised for our integrated farming systems, which will supply the world with global leadership on producing food and fashion among environmental challenges. I'm your host, Sarah Perium, and as passionate about navigating the future of these challenges as you, our viewers, live and listeners on demand are on the how. My role as a cog in the wheel to find solutions to our problems is to surface them for you on a plate here on Sarah's Country, but also yell from the rooftops on how uniquely different New Zealand's production systems are from the rest of the world. Let's be proud of it. In preparation for one of our first guests on the show tonight, I did a bit of a deep dive into the slides of a presentation at a recent Auckland Rural Investment Seminar presented by property brokers and guests. And a thought leader I do admire in New Zealand's agribusiness is Andy McFarlane, and his words were this: there is a cap on productivity for the foreseeable future, and exporters are challenging to premiumise the word New Zealand. But when 95% of global beef and milk is produced on grain-based rations, a global plant protein supply strongly dependent on glyphosate, GE technology, it's predominantly a monoculture inherently more vulnerable to disruption from pests, disease and chemical resistance. The answer then partly lies in the integrated farming systems in which New Zealand is a world leader. It's all well and good to be world leaders, but if we don't value that domestically here at home, we put industries out of business, and a sunset industry I fear is the New Zealand pork industry. Our country of origin labelling laws in this country are simply shite. And for all of the outgoing Green Party animal welfare activists' flaws, that is Gareth Hughes, it was a pet project of his, country of origin labelling. This is an area we need to seriously up our game. I was enjoying the opportunity that the discussion was to bring light to the large amounts of imported pork into this country from countries around the world with poorer standards of animal welfare than us here in New Zealand. When I say large, I'm talking 70% of pork in this country is imported from countries with poorer standards of animal welfare than us. I just had to repeat that. So if you didn't realise that, you now know. All of our processors here in New Zealand, all they have to do is import pork, smoke that bacon in Manuka, and they can call it made in New Zealand from local and imported products on the side. I ask you to look into the packet of every bacon brand as you're picking them up in the supermarket next time. I did that this afternoon, and I actually have certainly changed tact in the last couple of years on which way I consume, particularly pork. New Zealand's processing of our raw materials has been on the decline for decades. The amount of closed factories that added value and provided jobs and economic prosperity in our regions has been devastating. Excuse me. I would love to reminisce with you tonight live in the comments below on those New Zealand-made, particularly, say, fashion brands that have disappeared, and the manufacturing and added value that has disappeared from our regional towns. I want to hear from you. You know, the wool mills in South Canterbury and those fabric houses and Taronga. And I mean, I grew up, I went to boarding school in Dunedin, and it was Tamahini Knitwear and Alice Fibre. Alice Fibre went into receivership last year. I'd love to hear from you some of those favourite stories and brands. This is off the back of today's news that the New Zealand government are working on this with the announcement of Sleepyhead's new foam factory has been fast-tracked, and this is foam for mattresses. Is it a way of really tweaking the ability for us under changes to RMA to this is a Resource Management Act, to speed up the process of creating factories? Is that the hindrance? Or has it been the lack of capital return and the high cost of labour in this country? I mean, is the funding for lending through the Reserve Bank going to help? Or are we potentially now on a resurgence of New Zealand made again? But what we have learned from the past and our current labelling laws, as I just stated, to get this finally right, there is a huge opportunity, but we have to be proud to be transparent and authentic. So tonight on the show, a High Court judge ruled farrowing crates and mating stalls on pork farms within New Zealand are unlawful. This is following the news that Minister O'Connor pushed through this on the advice he had in 2018. Dr. Kirsty Chidgey, animal welfare scientist for New Zealand Pork, will join us, as I said, there after 7:20 to discuss what they intend to do about this to challenge it. At 7:30, a recent research report suggests that beef farming in New Zealand could significantly reduce greenhouse gases by folding calf production into the dairy beef sector. And this is potentially about ditching breeding cows. Bob Thomson from Agfirst will explain where there is some merit. Lastly on the show, Alliance Group is keeping a close eye on China. This is after China rebukes the Five Eyes security around New Zealand joining the protest against what's happening in Hong Kong. This is our major trading nation we're talking about. Murray Taggart, Chair for Alliance Group, will explain what this means to one of our major meat exporters. And we'll also celebrate Alliance's recent annual profit. But firstly, coming up on the show, what is that natural competitive advantage we have on the rest of the world? As I said, following the property brokers and Bob Thomson rural investment seminar in Auckland last week, GM for property brokers Conrad Wilkshire will break down why there's a lot of attractiveness in the dairy industry.
This is Sarah's Country.
Growing a better world takes courage. It takes foresight and vision. It's about dreaming big, then being brave enough to follow that dream through. To create a world where food is plentiful, soils are healthy, and rivers run crystal clear. A world where we grow more with less, where livestock is tended to with care. Energy is friend, not foe, and waste is a valuable resource. This is the world you're already shaping through imagination, innovation, and determination. So as small steps become huge leaps, you move boldly forward. And Rabobank is there beside you to help grow a better world together.
Really pleased we got into this. Thanks for your help, Dave.
It's a good idea, honey. You reckon it'll come out? Cover it and tell compound to leave it 10 minutes, and you'll be fine. Good call, Dave.
Good call on getting those security cameras, Dave.
You call a new one yet?
Yeah, kind of.
When you've got decisions to make, we'll be there to help you make the right call.
I'd go for those ones, Bob. Yeah, good call.
Did you choose these?
Oh, you know.
For great advice and insurance, talk to FMG.
Welcome if you have just tuned in live to Sarah's Country, wherever you are watching around the world, and to our on-demand listeners. It's absolutely amazing, as I said last week, to see how many viewers and listeners are tuning in from around the world. It's an absolute awesomeness. What I did was sort of start to talk about was reminiscing on some of those brands. You know, there was a lot of closure of manufacturing. I remember around that sort of late 90s, sort of early 2000s, etc., around New Zealand. And there seems to be a resurgence into how can we take back this New Zealand made product. I was saying there is a lot of barriers though still to that point, but I'd like to ask and get some feedback from you in the comments below. What are some of those brands that you were really angry about when they went overseas? It's not naming and shaming, but, you know, there's been some incredible New Zealand-made products that have gone overseas. Do we really have the substance for them to be back here? That's what I'd love to talk about with you tonight throughout the show. Now, last week there was a rural investment seminar in the Bob Thomson CBD offices in Auckland, where our next guest and his guests were on their soapbox to Queen Street investors, painting the natural competitive advantage we have on the rest of the world when it comes to the New Zealand primary sector, even with all the immediate challenges in front of us. Macfarlane Rural Business in Mid-Canterbury's solid dairy benchmark returns on their dairy clients reflects that shift in farming focus to sustainable returns, not production and underlying yield, and not simply price per hectare. Bottom line, many dairy farm businesses these days are cash flowing brilliantly across the country, and no less than my backyard here in Canterbury. We're joined now by Conrad Wilkshire, General Manager for Property Brokers. Hey Conrad, a really good presentation I had a flick through just before the show. But what was that key message you really wanted those Auckland investors to take away, that the market is in good stead?
Yeah, look, absolutely. Thanks, Sarah. Good to be on the show again. And no, it was a good turnout. And I think investors, and Auckland investors no less so, are looking for options. And our dairy sector particularly, we felt, has been overlooked. And I suppose the reasons for that, if you take Canterbury, there were only three commercial sales last year, when in time's gone by for about 21 million compared to, say, maybe 5 years ago, where it would have been closer to $500 million worth of sales. And so our view is that the hedge funds that were very active in the market, say 5 years ago, saw the long-term future in our dairy industry and could probably see the impact of global warming and a few other things in our natural, healthy food, sustainable food production. You take Canterbury as an example, we're actually using half the amount of water in our dairy systems than we would have, say, back in 2000. And it has a lot of natural advantages. Yet, we felt that actually there's not only New Zealand dairy farmers investing in that sector, but actually they're very well run. And Macfarlane Rural Business did a very good presentation, both Andy Macfarlane on the big picture and Jeremy on his Mid-Canterbury benchmark. And it busted a few myths, actually. The great majority on that benchmark with 34 farms are absentee owned. And the great majority of them have a really stable staff. The staff complement has often been there for a long time. It's not funny thing about Canterbury. Once you sort of put a stake in the ground there, they don't seem to leave in a hurry. And they've got really good cash flows. And so, on a $6.50 sort of return payout, these farm systems are dropping 7.5% cash yields. And as Con Williams, who's speaking on behalf of Farm Investments, the general manager there, he was just speaking to the fact that for the first time in farming, you can generate leverage returns based on cash flow. So there's no need to be, obviously capital growth over the long term in farming, I think, is still present. Our finishing farms would demonstrate that right now, if you look at the latest Ryan's returns. But even if you put all that aside, those returns in dairy are very good. And equally, even if you factor in, as Andy would say, some of the headwinds we've got with environmental planning, water use, there's a lot of science and there's a lot of action under the way to say, yes, they are risks that are present in the market, but they probably have been. It doesn't take anything away from that. These are good businesses, and actually our food holds a premium across all the categories, whether it be ingredients right through to some of those premium cream and cheese categories, all the rest of it. So a good catch-up, both hort and pastoral.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I do have the EBIT data breakdown there, and it's very good in terms of, even when you're climbing into the 55,000 a hectare, those returns stack up. That's when you're looking at a payout sort of 650 plus. But do you think there has been a few burnt toes and fingers from that sort of 2013, 14, correct me if I'm wrong, when we saw that significant milk payout drop under sub $4, and there's long memories in that.
Yeah, there is. And look, there's no question our dairy sector, the returns are cyclical. But if you look back at that time, it was a kind of a perfect storm. You had 2 years on the trot of low returns, but that was very much a fact of the quota coming off European supply. And those Irish farmers, for one example only, but it mirrors a lot, hadn't had they'd under-leveraged businesses, they'd been working under production constraints. And farmers the world over are the same. You take the constraints off and the production will rise. But that supply-demand imbalance, I think, has corrected significantly. And so you look at that, and then you look at, in the New Zealand context, you had the change on foreign policy, so the hedge funds weren't able to operate at the same level. And then you had the Fonterra went through a pretty tough time. That really knocked confidence in the market. And you look at the Fonterra turnaround, and Annie McFarlane spoke very well to that, and its focus on margin, not just volume, and the ability to manage costs. And you look at the turnaround in Fonterra's performance and its share price, none of those things were present a couple of years back. So I think if you have, and then, not to mention the regulatory changes, Reserve Bank changes on bank policy, environmental planning, it's a long list. And through all of that, these farmers have doubled down and come out the other side. So these dairy systems are compliant. They're working to very good industry standards. And so to our view, the pendulum's just sort of, the confidence pendulum swung far over to one side, and it probably just needs to come back to a bit of reality as to what these businesses really are.
Okay, I'm looking here at a Farmers Weekly article by Colin Willis-Croft about the 3 South Waikato dairy farms sold recently for more than $35 million. But as I'm sort of scrolling, correct me again if I'm wrong, it was still only around $27,500 per hectare though. I mean, are you saying that if you're a New Zealand investor right now, you can actually pick up quite a bargain?
Yeah, I think word would be value. If you compare the South Waikato dairy market to the Mid-Canterbury market, they're different soil types, different production systems. One's irrigated, one's non-irrigated. But there is no question there is value in that south. And we've seen more sales activity in the last couple of months than we have in the last couple of years in South Waikato. And we've successfully continued since the Atarangi sales, to which you refer. We've successfully concluded further sales in that market because, and the people buying those assets are long-term operators in that area, obviously operating at scale, but they really understand that market, and they really understand production systems in that location. And they're seeing value in terms of the underlying cash flow, and they're obviously getting the funding support to make that happen. And they're all NZ, either family-owned or large-scale farming NZ businesses that have been operating for a long time.
With as you said, the majority of absentee owners, my brother-in-law works in horticulture in the Bay of Plenty, and we were having a discussion on the weekend about the rise in directorship responsibility now to a lot of these key things, environmental regulations, health and safety, etc. Do you believe that is putting a lot of investors off as well in terms of where those corporate buying will have to have a lot more risk management around?
I think if I think back on the seminar we held last Wednesday in Auckland, we had both McFarlane Rural Business and Parent Ag, both with very big New Zealand footprints in terms of providing specialist advice. There is, I think, the human capital we have in our ag sector to be able to manage those risks and support either owner-operators, existing owner-operators, or particularly new investors. There's a lot of work that those businesses like Parent Ag and McFarlane Rural Business are doing that can help manage those risks and assess them and can help with the due diligence. So I don't see that as the barrier. I think it's been the perception of dairy as a sector and its responsibility to its environmental code and sustainable food production. And I think those questions are being addressed hard and fast. So I don't see those. There's definitely risks to be managed, nitrogen leaching, how we look at our carbon footprint overall. But I do believe there's any amount of advice for people to make a good arm's length decision around that. And when you compare our business model to how the international dairy business models operate and the kind of big, large-scale monocultures that we're competing with, particularly in the States, you then look at our integrated farm systems and the way we manage our farms. A lot of these farms are operating under System 2, System 3, and at large-scale operations. So I think we're well placed.
Ironies of what I'm hearing, where you have the banks trying to pull back their risk in terms of agricultural loan book, yet you have Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern this morning saying we just want to fund the productive sectors of New Zealand and get that money out there as fast as possible. What are you hearing from bank lending into the primary sector?
Well, I think to rule a line under the obvious, obviously COVID-19 has changed the landscape. So you look at the reliance on a productive sector today, New Zealand primary sector, is massive when you think about the education sector. I attended the Massey graduation last Friday, and that in international education was a big earner. You look for New Zealand, and then you look at our, the exports of tourism, and again, it's been set aside for the time being. So when you look at our primary sector, that's where do you put the capital? Where does the banks lend the capital? Then you also have our farming sector retiring $1.5 billion worth of debt. So for the first time in a long time, its net borrowing went down. And so I think if you have a look at the farming businesses, take the dairy, which has come under the real spotlight with its debt. It's had the third consistent payout in a row. It's retiring principal in line with and ahead of expectations. And it's a sector that continues to cash flow, so it's been re-rated. So I'm not saying there's not more to be done, but it's certainly the average debt out there, if you take the dairy sector, about $20 a kilo, which actually can be managed quite comfortably, certainly cash flow wise on current returns. So I would say that it's like all things. Often these things can be situational. Not to mention the Reserve Bank has pushed out another further 12 months to July 22. Before these regulatory changes around the capital people have to hold, banks have to hold against the rural sector has been pushed out. So I think it's quite a change. It's quite a change on 12 months ago.
Well, if you're looking at investing in the New Zealand dairy industry, now is the perfect time. Conrad Wilkshire, their GM for Property Brokers. Get in touch with the team at Property Brokers. I mean, golly gosh, yeah, there's a lot more going on behind the scenes and really start to stack up the returns that I've seen on the slides in that presentation to the Auckland investors in conjunction with Barefoot and Thomson. You really actually start to see a different picture. And as Conrad said there, we know in the industry that the dairy industry certainly stacks up in terms of the direction it's going environmentally as well. Loving your comments below. Now, let's celebrate those businesses who have stayed. Good idea, Michael. Gallagher is a great example. Product from them that we use in the UK comes from Hamilton. Fantastic. You're right. Let's celebrate those brands that could have gone overseas that continue to be manufactured here in this country. I have to give a shout out to my cousin Christina, who has a Perium fashion brand, who still sticks to being New Zealand made, manufactured in Tauranga. John says Swan Dry. Love those checks. Yes, sadly Swan Dry isn't produced here in New Zealand anymore. Does designed in New Zealand count? Is that the future that we want? Or are we seeing a resurgence in New Zealand processing? I'd love to hear what your thoughts are in the comments wherever you are listening or watching to Sarah's Country Live. Now, up next, is New Zealand pork on the brink of becoming a sunset industry? We're going to hear from Kirsty Chidgey, who is animal welfare scientist for New Zealand Pork, and her view after the High Court judge ruled that the animal welfare standards governing the use of farrowing crates and mating stools are unlawful and invalid.
This is Sarah's Country.
Every morning, Kiwi farmers wake up to produce high quality food. Yet, every night, some Kiwi families are going to sleep hungry. Meet the Need is a charity founded by farmers, and it's here to change all that. We're about New Zealand farmers feeding New Zealand families by donating a small part of what we grow when we can. You can help us make sure no one in New Zealand goes to sleep hungry again. Visit meettheneed.org and follow us on social.
And now, as reported by Gerald Pickard in this week's Farmers Weekly, New Zealand Pork is assessing its options after a High Court judge ruled that the animal welfare standards governing the use of farrowing crates and mating stools are unlawful and invalid. The judgment released by High Court Justice Helen Cull directed the Minister of Agriculture to consider recommending new regulations phasing out the use of farrowing crates and mating stools and consider making such changes as necessary to minimum standards. The case was brought to court by the New Zealand Animal Law Association, the one famously providing lawyers for animals, and animal welfare group SAFE. Now, this is following advice previously, a couple of years ago, to Minister O'Connor that the current standards of animal welfare in New Zealand were fine. We're joined now by Dr. Kirsty Chidgey, who is an animal welfare scientist for New Zealand Pork. Welcome to Sarah's Country. I know there's a lot of interested people to hear what you have to say tonight. Kirsty, could you just paint a picture for us around the advice that was originally given to the Minister?
Yeah, so in 2014 to 2016, NAUAC carried out a review of the use of farrow rates. And before that, they'd previously said that farrowing crates don't fully meet the obligations or all of the obligations of the Animal Welfare Act, but they were, effectively enabled through an exception in the Act that used to be available to allow certain practices to continue. In 2016, they sort of changed some of their advice a little bit by saying that farrowing crates were the minimum necessary to enable the obligations of the Act to be met. And in 2018, they sort of flip-flopped a little bit again with their submission to the Select Committee on the petition to ban farrowing crates and mating stools, again saying that they don't fully meet the obligations of the Act. So one of the key points of the court case was that inconsistency of advice that was provided around the use of farrowing crates, particularly in New Zealand.
Can you paint the picture for those who are not familiar with what a farrowing crate or a mating stool is and how it compares to practice globally?
Sure. So farrowing crates are the most common system that's used and to nurse their piglets in the global pork industry. In New Zealand, we've got less than 100 farmers, and half of those are indoor based and would be using, for the most part, farrowing crates, and some would be using mating stools, not quite as many. Farrowing crates are used to provide piglet protection mostly, and that's what they do achieve. we see much lower rates of piglet death in farrowing crates, and that's because they mostly reduce piglet crushing, which is one of the highest causes of piglet death before weaning. So that is the main reason why these systems are used. There's other reasons around things like stock person safety as well, and general management and husbandry, but primarily they provide piglet protection. Mating stalls are used for the purpose of mating only, and they are used for a maximum of 7 days, which is required for regulation, and farmers must provide documentation around that too. So again, it comes down to welfare, and it comes down to management as well, and making sure going forward that we do the welfare of the piglets as well as the welfare of the sows.
So what is New Zealand Pork doing to ensure that animal welfare is, in your opinion, upheld to a high standard?
So the pork is the Care on Farm Welfare Assurance Program, and around, it would be over 95% of commercial farmers are certified under pig care. So currently that assures compliance with the minimum standards and the regulations in the code, and it addresses other sort of non-code factors that are all indirectly or directly involved in animal welfare. So it means that every year, almost every commercial pig farm in New Zealand is audited to those standards, and that's that's one strength of that system.
And so, Kirsty, what does it look like under this new High Court ruling for the future for New Zealand pig farmers in regards to their production system? Is it not just as easy as allowing pigs to burrow and nest outside and being able to do as nature prevails it?
Well, that's the big question. What might farmers be required to transition to? How long might they have to do that? As an animal welfare advisor, it's really difficult for me because there are so many systems available and none of them are perfect. They all do their best to meet the needs of the sow and the piglet, but the real challenge is balancing those needs. And there is no alternative system that indoor farmers could use that would achieve the same outcomes for piglet welfare and piglet survival that farrowing crates currently achieve. Of course, the sow's welfare is important to be considered as well, but it's not as simple as identifying a particular system that farmers could move to, because that's really unclear at the moment.
Is there any other country in the world that will be similar to these type of rulings?
There are around 5 countries that have effectively phased out farrowing crates for all of lactation, but every single one of them allows them to be used in the first stages after a sow's birth. And that's in recognition that that's a really critical period where most piglet mortality happens. So none of them have agreed to completely ban farrowing crates. They've all enabled farmers to use them under certain conditions, and the acknowledgement that they do prevent pig deaths.
I have a very tear-jerking comment come in here that I do need to read out at the end to appreciate what is happening and to the industry at the moment. Kirsty, I do want to ask you, what type of cost will this add to the production of New Zealand pork, and ultimately what could happen with our imported pork figures so high already?
Yeah, obviously farmers will be in the position of deciding whether they can invest in a new system or whether they choose instead to exit the industry, which is a really difficult position for them to be in. Any shortfall in pork will very likely be made up from more imports with questionable welfare practices, and that is really concerning, and I don't think the average consumer would like to see that as an outcome. So that's one of the potential outcomes that our farmers are facing currently is that they may choose to exit the industry as a result.
So what's the strategy going forward for New Zealand pork? Can you appeal?
We can't directly appeal because we're not a party to the court proceedings ourselves. What's happening in the meantime is that the Code of Welfare is being reviewed. So we'll be involved in the review of the code and the drafting process of the new code, and that's being initiated now. So that's our immediate plan, is also to understand whether the regulations will be addressed through that code review process or whether they have to be dealt with before that happens in a shorter time frame.
We're going to be following this story with great interest. Thank you so much, Dr. Kirsty Chidgey there, who is an animal welfare scientist at New Zealand Pork, following a High Court ruling that the way the farrowing crates and mating stalls on New Zealand farms here are unlawful and invalid. Now, as I said, Hamish Blythe is a free-range producer in tears for the New Zealand pork industry. An unintended consequence of lockdown was also the closure of butchers. Personally, our sales for the year have gone from 800 to about 250. Yeah, absolutely highlighting the huge animal welfare that happened because of independent butchers not being able to open over COVID, which was absolute wrongdoing. Hamish, our thoughts are with you and all of the New Zealand pork farmers out there. And there is, of course, comments on the other side that piglet crushing is not an outcome of confining space. According to one viewer, does the market want pork raised in such an environment? Well, Michael, there is, potentially a lot of pork around the world being raised in hog hotels in China. Do we want that imported here as well? I look forward to following this because, of course, with any particular regulation changes, let's hope with this term government, there is more consultation happening with the industry. Now, after the break, research is suggesting that beef farming could significantly reduce its greenhouse gas footprint by folding calf production into dairy beef. This will be a very controversial article and report, but Bob Thomson from Agfirst will unpack how the report may be culling for ditching the breeding cow, but there may be some merits. All that up next on Sarah's Country.
This is Sarah's Country.
Delicious. Ever wondered where it starts? Does it start with care? Respect. Fresh grass, 365 days a year. The truth is, delicious doesn't start in a single moment or with a single ingredient. Delicious starts here.
The conversation tonight here on Sarah's Country is around New Zealand manufacturing, our adding value to our raw materials, both in the food and fashion industry. And as I was talking earlier, there has been a decline over the last couple of decades of this, but we may be seeing a resurgence with the RMA reforms of the Labour government and the instruction by Ms Ardern to pump money into the productive sectors. What's your thoughts on that? and what are some of those brands that, have proudly stayed here in New Zealand that you want to celebrate? Let us know in the comments below. But also some of those bygone eras. I mentioned Hamahini Knitwear and Alice Fibre in Dunedin that made wonderful duvets, linen, and of course knitwear, and the mills of South Canterbury. I mean, it's an absolute crying shame. But can we afford it, and do we have the capital to bring it back? I certainly hope so. Now, journalist Richard Rennie reported in this week's Farmers Weekly that research suggests that beef farming could significantly reduce its greenhouse gas footprint, but potentially from ditching the breeding cow. This is by folding calf production into the dairy beef sector. And it's been met with mixed response from farmers and advisors, I could imagine. The research focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions in New Zealand by suggesting the integration of dairy and beef production that could shave 22% off its annual greenhouse gas production. We are now joined by Bob Thomson, agribusiness consultant for Agfirst. Welcome to Sarah's Country, Bob. A pleasure to have you on the show.
Good evening, Sarah, and to your listeners too.
Now, how realistic is this reduction in beef breeding cow numbers that this report suggests?
Well, I don't think it is that realistic. I mean, I think we welcome papers like this to generate discussion around the different sorts of opportunities that we have, but to suggest we could ditch all of our breeding cows for dairy beef, I think is a step too far.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the decline of stock numbers is one quick solution, but is there merit in us, producing beef from more dairy cows and therefore reducing bobby calf numbers?
Yes, I've been a great advocate of that over the years, and I think that's huge. The question is, if we are to keep these bobby calves and rear them, which piece of land will they stand on? And that there's some real contention, I feel, around that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the beef cow's contribution to the entire farm system is something that's more than economic value and, of course, emissions. I mean, turning protein from unpalatable hill country into, a product that is of premium compared to dairy beef in the market that we want to be in.
Yes, the breeding cow performs a role which is not expressed in arguments, with gross margins. So what we're not taking account of is how these cows, the stock class, grooms pasture for other stock classes, and more particularly high-performance breeding ewes. And of course, they are great contributors, aren't they, to our farm returns. But sitting in behind them is that workhorse in the form of the breeding cow. And just to say that we can just ditch them and put dairy beef in their place is, as I say, I think a step too far on most of our extensive hill country. Now, there are cases for, having less breeding cows. There's definitely a case for that on some of our country, particularly our steep land, where soil disturbance can lead to soil loss. And, of course, with that soil loss of natural capital, and bound up on those soil particles, of course, we have our phosphate. So, we're just flushing, our natural capital down the dunny in some cases. And so we do really need to take a hard look at that on some of our farms. But to suggest overall that we can just ditch them willy-nilly is, as I say, a step too far.
Yeah, but if we look into a future of sex semen in the dairy industry, there will be a reduction in that particular cash flow for sheep and beef to graze bull beef, and they will need to turn to the value of a premiumised New Zealand beef product, which is based on less from more, isn't it? I mean, getting more quality, high quality and added value protein from that seed breeding cow.
Yeah, so now I'm guessing you're talking about having a dairy beef breeding cow as opposed to a traditional breeding cow. And there's serious merit in that too. There's a lot of pushback from traditional farmers, of course, in that regard. I mean, I've been promoting this since the beef breed evaluation trials back in the early 1980s. And without doubt, they are very productive. They don't look as good because, they do look a little like toast racks and in the middle of winter when we take condition off them. But they are productive. And we can make a terminal sire over a purpose type breed to generate some very high quality carcasses. And so, yes, that opportunity sits there. So you've still got a breeding cow, but a more productive breeding cow. And of course, the thing we must remember, and Stuart Ledgard has pointed us to the fact that if we are to address the carbon thing, we've got to appreciate that for every tonne of dry matter eaten, we're generating the same amount of methane, no matter what goes, no matter what it's fed to. So the efficiency of production from each tonne of dry matter eaten is a very important consideration out on our farms.
Okay.
And unfortunately, breeding cows don't cut the mustard in that regard, and so they're beaten up a lot. And as I point out, and I think in the same article that Richard produced this week was the note from James Parsons, just making the point that when we groom our pastures, we have better quality, our finishing cattle will finish a lot faster. And so it's quite a big can of worms when we start hooking into this discussion.
Great debate for the pub, Bob. You just put his cat amongst the pigeons and sit back and watch. It would be certainly one but it is a discussion we need to have. There's 1 million surplus bobby calves that need to be farmed and reared and finished in this country.
Yes, you're dead right. And we do need to address it. And I think most people will suggest that, we've got a 10-year window to get this sorted. I'd like to suggest that, yes, we can do stuff on our sheep and beef farms. And we all know that our sheep and beef farmers are becoming more and more mindful of this, more careful about the sorts of things they're doing with their land and their livestock. But the dairy sector needs to take some responsibility too. And so I've done some work around this, and I think that, the problem is with them and their bobby calves. And so they need to think about which piece of land these dairy beef calves are going to be raised, which piece of land they're going to stand on. I would suggest that we've got, firstly, we know that we've got 5 million dairy cows. Maybe we should have 1 million less of them and use that land, which, of course, has been taken from our sheep and beef farmers, to finish these dairy beef cattle.
Beef farmers and dairy farmers on that debate on who takes responsibility for that particular problem, Bob. And I know you know that very well in your role as agribusiness consultant for Agfirst. Hey, check out the article in Farmers Weekly by Richard Rennie. It's a very good read, very balanced, and of course, Sarah's Country is produced in alliance with the great team at Farmers Weekly, farmersweekly.co.nz. You can sign up to My Daily Digest and you get all the latest every single day in your inbox. And if you do it within the next week or two, you could be taking home a Honda motorbike, an XR 150 for Christmas. Why not? It's a very good value exchange in my mind. Now, last up on the show, I'm going to have Murray Taggart with us, chair of Alliance Group, on how Alliance is a very close eye on China and also celebrate with them on their very positive annual results.
This is Sarah's Country.
The recipe for perfect beef and lamb. Take one small fresh country. Make sure it's nice and remote. Now, keep it at the ideal temperature all year round. Next, mix in the farmers. They go perfectly with the nature of this unique place. Add regular sprinkles of rain to really bring out the lush meadow grass. Then let your animals happily graze on this grass all day, every day. have it. New Zealand. The perfect recipe for beef and lamb. Taste pure nature.
I like this quote, market agility is absolutely critical in the current environment. This is from Murray Taggart, Chair of Alliance Group, and this is following 30% of our meat going to China is potentially under threat as recent developments on the Asian giant rebuking the Five Eyes Security Alliance, calling for China, which New Zealand's a part of, to stop undermining the rights of people in Hong Kong and condemning new rules to disqualify elected legislators in Hong Kong. Just days after signing this regional comprehensive and economic partnership, trade and investment pact spearheaded by China. Now, we are joined by Murray Taggart from Alliance. Welcome to Serious Country, Murray. I mean, I understand that Alliance is one of our largest meat processors in New Zealand, but small fry when it comes to large global unrest like this.
Yeah, good evening, Sarah. I think the way we look at this is that this is sort of government to government type issues that we're talking about there, and as a trading company, we have to trade within the rules that are determined by governments. So it's not something that we can really influence. Obviously, we watch it closely, and it has a bearing on how we might view the trade. But and it's the same at the other end in China. There'll be our partners over there. They're equally keen to see the trade continue, and so they will equally have no real say in what their government does.
And as I said, the market agility is absolutely critical. That you were quoted there in saying that. And over the last 12 months, there has been periods where Alliance have reduced product, put it into other markets. Does that come at the detriment of relationship with China?
No, when we move product around and change the emphasis on one market or another, we're obviously in very close contact with our in-market partners when we do something like that, because as you suggest, we're not in the game of trying to offend long-standing partners. So yeah, we when we're moving away from, say, China, that'll be when our partners there are saying, look, actually there might be a huge flow of South American beef or something coming into the market. It's going to depress prices for a period. If we keep sending at the rate we are, all we're going to do is compound the problem. So if we've got a better option somewhere else, it's a win-win for everyone.
Talking about that, I mean, this particular COVID case in China connected to that part of the world. New Zealand is not the source of the contamination. I do want to talk about the great work Alliance did over the period of time that we were in level 4 lockdown in comparison to what we saw in places like the States. What has been some of your learnings over that period, Murray, if we were to see ourselves in that particular situation again, leading into a particular dry summer potentially again?
Yeah, look, the first thing is it's critical that we ensure the government recognises that we need to be declared an essential industry. And of course, that wasn't a given at the start of the level 4 lockdown that we have been through. So that's step one. The next step is to ensure we've got industry-wide agreement with government on what the rules of the lockdown are. And that was quite challenging in the initial stages of level 4 lockdown. And there's no guarantee that the same rules will prevail the next time round, because there could be different circumstances. So, we have to make sure we're all singing from the same hymn book when we're negotiating with government, and ensuring that they're very aware of what the situation we face.
Let's talk about the annual profit of 27.4 million adjusted to 7.4 million before tax in a very hard-hitting year, and paying partly subsidies back. That's a good result.
Yeah, look, we were pretty pleased to end up with a result like that. You know, if we go back to March when we were sort of looking forward, about to go into lockdown, and the world was sort of starting to look pretty uncertain. Gee, if someone had told us we could come out with a result like this, we would have been pretty pleased. And so, you know, it still feels like a small amount of money for a huge amount of turnover, but in the context of the year we've had, we'll take it.
Yeah, wipe the slate clean. But we do have to talk, there's 20 million provisions still sitting on the books for historic partial non-compliance for employee entitlements. But you think that's going to be wrapped up with the Meat Workers Union shortly?
We certainly hope so. Obviously, we've had negotiations with the union to arrive at that amount, and then they have to take it to their members for ratification. And so really, we just await them having that vote.
There is a crying labour shortage in the meat processing industry, like there is in every part of our industry, and Surma Karapiva from the Meat Industry Association has been highlighting that for us. I mean, when you've got this type of stuff going on, it doesn't look good for the industry, though, to attract talent.
You mean in terms of that Donning and Doffin case?
Yes, yeah, and just in terms of perception.
Yeah, I think that that case is not just going to have impacts on the meat industry. That's going to impact a whole lot of industries where there's protective clothing worn, and essentially it was a result of a court action between the Ovation Meat Company and the Meat Workers Union. But as I say, it doesn't. That means that everyone then has to sort of look at how they were acting over that time, and it doesn't, as I say, it doesn't just affect the meat industry. So I don't think we're tarred with any brush in that regard.
Oh, that's good to hear. But let's talk about the fact that what's looking ahead is that food service around the world is not going to be returning in a huge hurry in 2021. There's been some strong market signals there to flow through to store prices. And the shining light to get us through really is still the country we opened this interview with, China.
Yeah, very much. And I should say, look, food service, we did see a few wee green shoots there in sort of Europe and North America, but unfortunately, as this next wave of COVID is sweeping through, then that's really put paid to that one. But certainly, China's been the shining light. You know, they got the COVID early, dealt with it well, and you know, really life has returned from a meat export perspective to pretty much normal. And so, yeah, we're very grateful for the opportunity to be able to export to China.
Yeah. Lastly, let's talk about some of our other markets, if that's all right with you, Murray, especially in Alliance's premium products such as tomato lamb, Salia Merino, into our markets such as the UK and the US. With the rise of nationalism, how is the team feeling at Alliance about how to combat this?
Yeah, we're not too worried about the rise of nationalism. I guess the one that worries us a little bit more is a trend towards more protectionism in trade. And this was actually happening before COVID came along, but COVID seems to have sort of accentuated that issue. And so, you know, and you've seen it with the Trump administration, and there's no guarantee the Biden administration won't have a similar view. Now, we're fortunate that there's not a big sheep meat industry in North America, and so we don't tend to be a target of that sort of thing, but it's certainly something that we watch with interest.
So how are you feeling in terms of crystal ball gazing into the next financial year, Murray? I mean, is it, if you've come through it not too badly this time, is it sort of sit and wait and see, or do you think that we're okay to navigate these storms?
Oh, look, we're pretty confident there's still opportunities out there. Clearly, not so much in food service at the moment, but in high-end retail and online shopping and home delivery, they're all areas where there's opportunity, and certainly in those latter two, they've grown enormously since COVID first came on the scene. So, you know, you never want to think there's no opportunity there, and the same people that we're going to pay good money at a restaurant they're still happy to pay good money for top quality products.
Absolutely. A restaurant-like experience when you're in lockdown at home. People still want luxury when they can, and if they're going to eat less meat, why not eat the best meat? That's the New Zealand message. Thank you so much, Murray Taggart, Chair of the Alliance Group. You can catch all of the interviews for Sarah's Country first thing in the morning. They are available on podcast wherever you like to listen to your podcast, or head to sarahscountry.com to go back through the entire library. And of course, all of these stories have been brought to you by the great team at Farmers Weekly, where you can get the full in-depth journalism around all the matters that matter most to farming, food and fibre here in New Zealand. Tomorrow on the show, Rob Hewitt, Chair of the Strong Wool Action Group, will discuss how they are open for contributions and are working towards a budget on this. Brendan Williams joins us, who's a Horizons arable finishing farmer and a Balanced Farm Environment Award. We'll learn more on how he achieves that in balance. We're going to celebrate with Dr. Trish Fraser, soil scientist for plant and food research, who has been taken home the Woman of Influence in the Rural category award. And Dominic Jones, co-founder of Origin Capital Partners, will talk about an investment fund aimed specifically at raising money to purchase existing or greenfield sun gold kiwi fruit orchards. All that up tomorrow live on Sarah's Country from 7 p.m, as well as, of course, on demand on podcast. Just getting there to some of those comments before we go. We have a lot of bobby calf problems is consumer driven. They don't like the Jersey yellow fat. No bobby calf policy here. Every live calf which hits the ground goes on to have a life. Paul Harris says, good work, Bob. More integrated dairy farms. That is from the whānau around Sarah's Country that tune in so wonderfully with us here live. And of course, all of you listening on demand. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us. In the meantime, good night and go well.
This is Sarah's Country.